The election of 2020 will go down in history for being one of the most intense ever. But 23 years ago, there was an election that had people confused, baffled, and lost. It came down to one state, whose governor just so happened to be one of the candidates' brothers. This week we are covering Bush versus Gore and the month-long struggle to decide who our 43rd president would be. This is your host, Rachel Payton, and you're listening to the Chronicles of Time. Before we dive into election night, let's get to know our candidates. For the Republican Party, we have the charismatic 54-year-old son of the 41st president and governor of Texas, George W. Bush. And for the Democratic Party, we have seemingly uptight 51-year-old Al Gore, who has just spent 8 years as vice president under Bill Clinton. It's the 54th election, and it's held on Tuesday, November 7th, 2000. By the end of the day, polls were coming in, but it would end up being one of the closest elections in American history. It came down to one state to determine the election, Florida. Florida has 25 electoral votes that both the gentlemen needed to get them to the 270 required to win. The fiasco was about to begin. Networks declared Gore the winner of Florida before the polls were even closed. This left Americans thinking their vote didn't even matter, and if they should even vote since it's been called. The networks would retract their previous declaration of Gore winning and say it was too close to call. Americans never expected not to find out who won that day. That was unusual. It just didn't happen. In the middle of the night, around 2 a.m., Fox News declared Bush the winner. After hearing this, Gore called Bush around 3 a.m. to concede. But he would later call him back, retracting his concession, saying it was too close to call yet again. This embarrassment would teach networks to never call an election early just to beat the other networks, and this also portrayed Gore to be a sore loser. The next day on November 8th, less than 2,000 votes of the 6 million cast in Florida had Bush pulling ahead. This caused an automatic recount by Florida law. This count was done by machines, and the results were closer than ever. Bush was in the lead, but only by 327 votes. Gore had the option of a manual recount, which of course he took advantage of. He was able to pick which counties of the 67 he wanted to conduct a recount. He chose 4: Miami-Dade, Volusia, Palm Beach, and Broward County. Florida says you have 7 days after an election to get the results in, and it just so happens 3 out of the 4 counties didn't have their counts finished by the deadline. But here's where it starts to get interesting. Who was the governor of Florida at the time? Jeb Bush, George W.'s brother. And the Secretary of State of Florida? None other than Katherine Harris, co-chair on the Bush campaign. Secretary of State Harris made an attempt to end the recounts, but Gore sued her. On November 21st, the Florida Supreme Court said Harris must allow the recounts until November 26th. When the 26th came around, Bush was ahead in Florida by 537 votes, and Katherine Harris certified the election. Once again, Gore says the counts aren't done. The Florida Supreme Court yet another time sided with Gore, declaring all votes not counted by voting machines must be manually recounted. You may be asking yourself, why does the state of Florida take so long to count votes? Well, folks, Florida's ballots were a complete debacle. Counties had different ways of voting, and one way was to punch out your vote on the ballot. If you didn't punch it out all the way, it would leave what was known as a hanging chad. The question was, do you count the hanging chads since the votes aren't 100% punched through? Questions like these and others drew the process out. It also had people feeling angry and confused, feeling as if their vote didn't even matter. Bush was unhappy with the Florida Supreme Court's decision to manually count the votes. He decided it violated the 14th Amendment, so he appealed it to the United States Supreme Court. 36 days after the election, on December 12th, the Supreme Court had its answer. By a 7-2 vote, they had decided the methods and standards varying county to county violate the 14th Amendment. They also voted 5-4 that no new recount could take place by the time the Electoral College met on December 18th. Simply put, they were out of time and options. So, with the 537 votes ahead, George W. Bush was our 43rd president. On December 13th, Gore gave a televised speech in which he said, "I strongly disagree with the court's decision, but I accept it." He would also call Bush to concede and joke that he wouldn't call him back this time. And unlike they would today, people didn't question the outcome of the election very much. I think people may have been confused due to the way they decided the winner. Although Gore received over 500,000 more votes than Bush, he still lost. The last time this happened was in 1888 with Benjamin Harrison. We saw this again in 2016 when Clinton received over 2.8 million more votes than Trump. This has caused many people to want to do away with the Electoral College altogether. But as for now, this is what we continue to use in our elections. To ensure we never have an election like the one in 2000, Congress passed the Help America Vote Act, or HAVA, in 2002. This allotted $4 billion to states to replace old voting machines. You would have thought this would have crossed someone's mind before 2002. But anyways, Bush has received much criticism for his 8 years in office. Between how he handled 9/11 and leading the country into a recession, he is rarely mentioned as a stellar president. After years to reflect, people wonder how different life would have been with Gore as chief. It's hard to predict, considering nearly everything Bush did. I assume Gore would have done the exact opposite. The election and political environment are much different nowadays. The intensity has caused a great divide in the country. The whole situation just couldn't happen today, I don't believe. And that is the 2000s election. If you have any questions or comments or just want to talk about it, you can email me at the Chronicles of Time podcast at gmail.com. And if you like this episode, feel free to rate and review it. And thank you so much for listening. I'm your host, Rachel Payton, and this has been the Chronicles of Time.